The following discussion was held between 26 March and April 5, 2018 in Google Docs. The objective was to wrestle with key queries and issues revolving around research protocols and methodologies for scholars exploring internet-based fan cultures and practices. At the heart of these issues is how researchers might define toxicity in relation to fan practices as well as the way in which scholars approach the study of fan cultures from various positions. Henry Jenkins kindly provided a series of insights regarding fundamentally important issues around defining certain fan practices as toxic, and these are included too for readers interested in further research into online territories. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 371. Henry Jenkins. General discussions of toxic fandom in the mass media and elsewhere make assumptions that are hard to address without more foundational work in fan studies. Some core questions the field would need to consider include: can we distinguish meaningfully between fans and trolls, as discussed for example by Whitney Phillips and others? Can we distinguish between fans who have a commitment to fandom as an ongoing social and cultural community and other groups and individuals who draw on references to popular culture or tap fan practices for their own purposes? And does this open up larger theoretical questions about what it means to operate within or outside fandom? Can we talk about toxic fan masculinity without the broader theorization of gendered fan identities and practices? One that includes more benign forms of fan masculinity or more toxic forms of fan femininity? Or for that matter, can we situate toxic masculinity against more general forms of hegemonic masculinity? Can we talk about an increase or intensification of toxic fan practices without a broader historical frame which looks at gendered and racialized animosities in fan culture over time? And can we understand toxic fandom without pathologizing fans if we do not draw on broader frameworks of patriarchy and systemic racism? What other kinds of foundational work need to be done if we are going to address some of the controversial and abusive practices in fandom? We begin with a general question about defining the toxic subject and associated fan practices. What is meant by the term toxic as it relates to fan behaviors and practices? Mel Stanfill. So, I'd say the low-hanging fruit on toxicity is hostility and aggression, getting in people's faces, anonymous or non-anonymous, harassment, naming and shaming, like block lists, etc. That's what people usually think of, those sorts of methods issues. That's the 101 conversation. But there are a couple of 202 conversations, let's call them 202A and 202B, that I think are more interesting, and maybe more important, because they're not as well understood. 202A is something like fandoms are exclusionary and toxic to the people they exclude. Most fandoms, at least, the Anglophone ones with which I am familiar, are exclusionary to people of color. Many are exclusionary to women, cf. Gamergate, sad, rabid puppies, etc. And some are exclusionary to queer people, and of course people of color can also be queer and/or women, and women can be queer, but think of this all as a big Venn diagram. At this level I'm talking about everything from active racism to dismissal of fans of color's concerns. Structural exclusion is a 303 thing. 1. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 372. Example that comes to mind is deifying Emily Andras for her representation of white, skinny, queer women and refusing to listen to criticism about lack of women of color in her work. 202B is related but different. It's the perception that people of color, queer folks, and/or women seeking inclusion is itself toxic, regardless of tactics. This plays on tropes of aggressive people of color, particularly Black and Latinx folks in the U.S. context I'm familiar with, and predatory queer folks, and it takes the hurt feelings of majoritarians as evidence of minoritarian violence. I have seen this a lot in accusations from heterosexual fans that queer fans tweeting to showrunners are harassing them, regardless of how polite they are. Which, yes, sometimes they aren't. William, Billy, Proctor. I'm not familiar with the terms majoritarian or minoritarian violence, but I think I get the general gist. Okay, so aggression and hostility are forms of toxicity. However, many fan cultures are often hostile or aggressive, but may not necessarily be toxic. This reminds me of a quote from Cornel Sandvoss. Online fan spaces offering focal points for fan communities are far from universal. Like all communities, they are based on the necessity of othering and distinction. 2011, 62. And one from Catherine Larson and Lynn Zupernis regarding supernatural fans. Aggression serves instrumental functions within a group by helping to enforce norms, build cohesion, and defend against outsiders. 121. So, considering that fan cultures are neither homogeneous nor harmonious, which behaviors are we singling out as toxic? Mel, you have raised racism and misogyny as toxic fan practices and I think many scholars would agree, but what about other forms of hostility and aggression? Is it toxic, say, to shout abuse at an opposing football team? Fans? Perhaps more urgently, who decides what is toxic and what is benign? Are we, as scholars and researchers, making these moral and ethical judgments? Or should we be analyzing what fan practices have been discursively constructed as toxic by fans and journalists, etc.? Ruckmany panned. I'm going to jump off from Mel's excellent characterization of the debates around the definition of toxicity and the points Billy raises to think through how we conceive of violence/hostility/aggression within fandom spaces. To me, the definition of toxicity is always going to be bound up in ideas of privilege and power. So while, of course, fandoms. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 373. Have always been marked by some degree of conflict, perhaps a productive framing of toxicity would be to put that definition in relationship to systemic power structures, which would obviously vary from context to context. Mel's point about being careful that majoritarian hurt feelings are not given the same weight as the effect of structural power differentials around race, gender, sexuality, etc. is key for me as well. So in my view, this isn't about researchers applying a moral or ethical judgment, but analyzing these fan practices with knowledge with how they intersect with the power structures I have just mentioned. So for instance, for me, the backlash against Ghostbusters and Ocean's 8 is not equivalent to the criticism of Iron Fist, even though in both cases it is fans being critical of casting decisions. To refer to Billy's example, when approaching the issue of shouting abuse at an opposite team, I think the question would be whether the content of what is being shouted is inflected by racism/misogyny/homophobia, etc. Relatedly, we cannot analyze issues of hostility and aggression without also bringing into focus who these labels are being applied towards. I think that the most overt forms of this are well documented as controversies like Gamergate, Sad Puppies, etc. are marked by direct threats of violence and, relatively, easily identifiable expressions of racism, misogyny, homophobia, etc. However, as I've been talking about in my own work, this sometimes leads to a lack of attention to how whiteness structures fandom spaces where women and/or queer fans are more active. So non-white fans are often seen to disrupt operations of pleasure around het/and fem/ships because they object to the, often automatic, primacy granted to white characters within fandom spaces. Black fans especially have been talking about these dynamics, and I'm linking here to Zena Hutton's @Stithimensory, great blog post on the topic stitchmediamix.com web link. I think fan scholars always have to be alert to these dynamics when framing their questions and then produce context-specific definitions of toxicity. Richard McCulloch. I think Mel, Billy and Druckmann have all raised some fantastic points so far, but collectively, they also point towards some of the reasons why this is such a thorny and interesting subject of debate. In particular, I love Druckmann's distinction between the respective backlashes against Ghostbusters and Iron Fist. I completely agree that, if we want to understand the hostile and/or exclusionary practices Mel mentioned, and if we want to contribute towards explanations of how and why they occur, then we absolutely do need to be thinking in terms of how they relate to power structures that exist far beyond a given fan community. That said, there is a methodological dimension to this debate that has not really been addressed yet, one that has big implications for the ways in which the word toxic has found its way into both journalistic and academic conversations about fandom. One of the things I love about audience and fan studies is that it is so well positioned to capture the complex relationship between structure, on the one hand, and agency on the other. But if our basis for defining toxicity is whether or not some observed behavior, Volume 15, Issue 1, May 2018, page 374, reinforces or challenges existing power structures, then I think we are in danger of being overly deterministic and or making sweeping generalizations about large, heterogeneous groups of people. My argument here is that those structures are indeed vitally important, but they should not be our starting point. Fan studies, having emerged out of a cultural studies tradition, is a field that has always attempted, as far as possible, to avoid making moral judgments about why people behave in particular ways, aiming instead to understand the contexts in which those behaviors are enacted, and how the people involved justify their own actions. This approach, at least from what I have seen, is more likely to be ignored when it comes to studying and talking about toxic fan practices. The furor around The Last Jedi is a good example of this, as commentators, academics included, were incredibly quick to separate the film's detractors from its embracers, not only in an effective sense, but in relation to an assumed ideological position. See Billy's recent series of essays and roundtable discussions on this controversy on Henry Jenkins' blog. For more on this, henryjenkins.org web link. The imputations were strong with this one. Quite simply, I find it very strange that such judgments are now occurring so routinely in a discipline that has spent so long trying to avoid pathologizing its subjects. I also remember reading a few months ago about large groups of Rick and Morty fans congregating at their local McDonald's to demand Szechuan sauce, becoming overly aggressive and, in some cases, threatening towards restaurant employees. What puzzled me about the coverage was not so much that their behavior was reported and criticized, but that it was also linked to earlier instances of Rick and Morty fans harassing the show's female writers. These two incidents may indeed be linked, but how can we be sure that, A, they really are linked, and that, B, the link is the one we assume it to be? Do we know that the same fans were involved in both incidents? Even if they were, do we know why they chose to act like this? Most importantly, why are we assuming that these are the actions of a homogeneous group of people acting for a coherent set of reasons, when, as Billy points out, everything we know about audiences and fans tells us the opposite is far more likely? Something similar has happened in political discourse, with Americans who voted for Trump, or Britons who voted to leave the EU, overwhelmingly castigated as racists, idiots, or simply as deplorables. Without wanting to dismiss those claims outright, I would simply say that, as academics, we should be above tarring masses of people with any single ideological brush. There is obviously an ethical dimension to this too, in that the will to moralize often seems to be overriding attempts to study this phenomenon from the perspective of those involved. To be clear, I have absolutely no wish to condone or defend any of the practices mentioned so far, nor any others that we could potentially include in this debate. Rather, I am saying that if we really want to understand why toxic behavior happens, we need to try to park our moral compasses at the gate. This is the approach taken by some of the most fascinating and illuminating studies of abhorrent human behavior, such as Christopher. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 375. Browning's Ordinary Men, 1992, and Hannah Arendt Seichmann in Jerusalem, 1963. What I love about both books is that, even though they are studying people who committed or ordered truly horrifying acts of violence during the Holocaust, the authors put morality to one side in favor of trying to understand the personal and contextual circumstances that facilitated and or motivated their actions. Crucially, by aspiring to take morality out of the equation and pay close attention to individual agency, we actually learn far more about the power structures involved, not only how such structures allow it or constrain our behavior, but also where they might be vulnerable to abuse, exploitation and manipulation. And indeed, where structural power is at its weakest. I'd like to see audience and fan studies scholars doing something similar when it comes to studying hostile and exclusionary fan practices, maintaining skepticism in the face of widespread moralizing, and sticking resolutely to a principle of trying to understand people on their own terms. This shouldn't preclude us from making judgments altogether, but it should help to ensure those judgments are more accurate and more useful. Billy. I agree with you, Richard, well said. What troubles me is the will to apply the label of toxicity so readily to certain fan practices, not by journalists and fans themselves, but by academics. The term is under-theorized at present, and massively so, becoming a yardstick with which to address these behaviors in moral and ethical terms. My research on Black Stormtrooper, The Last Jedi, and Ghostbusters used established research protocols to fully analyze the contents of hashtags and forum threads, and the results were far more complicated and complex than current discourses would seem to permit. I also find it worrying that it is essentially reactionary screeds and currents are being singled out as toxic. What about progressive, left-leaning actors? There is an abundance of evidence that certain commenters, I don't know if they're fans or not, from the progressive left also engage in such practices, as well as women too. Jessica Austin's paper at FSN in 2017 was the start of a much longer conversation about toxic femininity. Although I'm not convinced it is femininity per se that is being performed in these high-profile cases simply just because they emanate from a female contingent, I don't think it is particularly feminine for a One Direction fan to threaten to pour fucking bleach down someone's throat. Jack Halberstam's theory of female masculinity may be an avenue worth exploring. With thanks to Bridget Kais for recommending that. Perhaps the same can be said of female Star Wars fans that evoked Drake analogies and metaphors yet directed them towards an imagined and imaginary community of butthurt sad little boys crying oceans of male tears. Personally, I can't see how this kind of repost is anything but a type of fight fire with fire, which does not mean that this cannot be viewed as toxic as well. Two wrongs don't make a right, and all that, especially given our current frameworks and a distinct lack of methodological protocol. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 376. On the latter, I believe I have been quite wrong in the past. In a chapter I wrote on One Direction fans and the Channel 4 documentary film, Crazy About One Direction, I explain aggressive practices as performative and unlikely to be carried through. Beth Jones' chapter on One Direction fans in the same collection heads in this direction. Both of us argue that Directioners and we could add many female-centric fan cultures to this are often infantilized by media commentators and geek fans. However, I strongly believe that I was wrong in this, primarily because both Bethan and I, arguably and inadvertently, are infantilized Directioners by excusing what we may call toxic fan practices as mere performance and, ultimately, not real. In doing so, we let them off and defended them from excoriation, whether we intended to do so or not. I cannot speak for Bethany, naturally. But this is simply my reading of our parallel accounts. But that introduces an unstable element, and one that requires significant address. Here's what I mean by our infantilization. In this context, Gamergate actors are toxic. We do not view them as performative but as insidious and ideologically risible, and I'm not saying that they're not. One Direction fans are non-toxic. We view them as performative, innocuous, and innocent. Why is this? I'm not saying that Directioners are toxic, but it certainly seems as if there is a double standard at work, at least to my thinking. I suspect I may have positioned Directioner fan discourse as performative and innocuous primarily because those represented in the Channel 4 documentary are young girls, something that Bethan and I pushed back against. To be clear, I am not claiming that women and men are ideological equals, but the way in which extant research seems to cover reactionary currents only, while excusing progressive or female toxicity, demands refocusing. If nothing else, fan studies may be guilty of establishing a skewed portrait of the political constituency of fan cultures across the board. As a researcher, I strongly believe that methodology and epistemology should be at the core of audience, reception and fan studies. I have yet to see a robust quantitative/qualitative study of what happened during Gamergate without reproducing press accounts. Unequivocally, how would we explain the fact that women were also involved in Gamergate? I want to say that the campaign was all men, but even a cursory scroll of Twitter feeds tells us that this is not so simple, as if we could tell gender from pseudonymous avatars in any case. Although I am well aware that male video game fans led the charge, the situation is so much more complex than current research seems able to account for and examine rigorously. This brings me full circle. How do we know if commenters are fans or trolls? What methodological instruments are brought to bear on campaigns and discourses of this sort? For if the #boycott_StarWarsVi contains a ratio of progressive/reactionary comments that shows the former at 96% and the latter at 4%, then we could quite easily. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 377. Problematize press accounts that evoke this as a racist hashtag. How do we single out trolling operations from the real ideological consistency of fans, which would not be monolithic? At this point in time, I think the term toxicity has little academic value whatsoever, unless produced discursively by other agents that require analysis without morality. Bertha Chin. I agree with Mel that anything amounting to hostility and aggression in fan behaviors would be toxic. However, this hostility and aggression can also be internalized, in ways that a fan is made to feel, especially if the ways they read a text and the ships they support differ from the majority-approved reading or officially sanctioned ones. Here I'm thinking of examples I've seen, from talking to a fan fiction author from early X-Files days who discussed how betrayed they felt upon discovering their fan fiction have received a lot of criticism on a live journal community called fanfic_hate, created for anonymous commentary, and how criticism of their creative works have extended to personal attacks that often contain details about their personal lives. Or a more recent example on CW's The Flash between fans who ship Barry Allen and Iris West Allen, and those who ship Allen with Caitlin Snow Barry, with the latter fans often shamed for their racism. And while this, Iris West being African American on the show, may indeed be an issue for some, I think it's crucial we not overlook the elements of policing within the fandom that has led to toxic behavior being directed towards the fans and the actors. Of course, fan policing is very much rooted in conceptions of power, and with that privilege, as Rukmini and Richard have astutely mentioned. Fans with the loudest voices and strength in numbers online often attract attention, and a showrunner's attention can lead to the policing of what is and isn't appropriate fan behavior online in order to maintain that attention. See Scott's article in this theme section. Fan scholars have observed fans' tendencies to be exclusionary, but fans' increasing public presence on social media networks, as opposed to more private spaces like LiveJournal, have heightened this behavior policing, and as divisions grow, the toxic behaviors and practices, shaming fans for reading a text a particular way or shipping a non-sanctioned couple, death threats to fans and actors, become more public too. My point being, certainly, issues surrounding exclusion of fans of color, women, queer fans and others are important and need to be addressed. But the toxic behavior that arises out of fan policing is, I think, equally important, and if fans are being shamed for their fan practices, or not supporting a mixed-race couple, then it potentially limits any productive discourse to be had about bigger issues such as racism, sexism and homophobia. This is where Richard's point about checking our own moral judgment at the gate comes in handy, in looking at where the accusations of discrimination originates from, and if it comes from the desire to police appropriate behaviors in order to present and maintain an Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 378. Idealized notion of fandom to showrunners and the media industry, then something else is at play here. I think Billy also raises an important, if not uncomfortable, point about our role as researchers and how we might, at times, in our research end up excusing certain behaviors. And to borrow Billy's term, or infantilize some fans because of the ways in which the media and the public have positioned them. For me, it certainly raises issues of internalized misogyny, sexism and colonialism, issues which I'm seeing more frequently the longer I remain in Asia, which I think is something we need to be more reflexive about in our own work. Now, thinking about this question Rukmini and Richard raised about whether we as researchers should make moral judgments, I feel like I want to push back on that and go back to standpoint theory. We're always talking from somewhere, and to pretend that we're not is to treat our situatedness as neutrality. That way lies both sidesism and profiling every neo-Nazi in America in the New York Times as if their perspectives deserve the airtime. You know? See editor's introduction in this theme section. Things can be worth studying and still be awful, and we do no favors not saying that they're awful when they are. And I think we can do that while still maintaining awareness of the power we have as academics over the people we write about. To Billy's question about toxicity's definitional fuzziness, I wonder if we should go back to the place where, to my knowledge, the term entered the conversation, toxic masculinity. In that framework, it's the particular kind of masculinity rooted in domination that's a problem. So then, the reactionary, or majoritarian, that is, those representing the dominant category, which will be contextual, responses will more easily be toxic. Whiteness, is a relation of domination. Hegemonic masculinity is a relation of domination. Heterosexism is a relation of domination. By contrast, actions by people without institutional or structural power will have to meet a higher threshold to cross into toxicity because domination is not as attainable when you're punching up. So then, to account for something like women in Gamergate, and bracketing the fact that some unknown proportion were sock puppets, we could look at Jesse Daniels' work on women and white supremacy, not because those people were necessarily white supremacists, at least, not overtly, but because she analyzes how white women gain privilege from compliance with white supremacist patriarchy. Again, this is why we can't take toxicity apart from relations of domination. Then, if we're thinking about domination, it doesn't matter whether somebody means it or not, that is, trolling versus sincere. For the measure of toxicity, it would matter for understanding the phenomenon. Of course, the act of domination is what matters. But Bertha's points are also fascinating, and they point to the weaponization of social justice in fandom that is really poorly understood, and I really hope her book with Mark, Volume 15, Issue 1, May 2018, page 379. Stewart studies it. That is what people used to mean by social justice warrior, before it got as politicized as it is now. People who perform, but do not genuinely believe in social justice, purely in order to score points. It also points back to what I call the 303 conversation. People's understanding of structural inequality is not good generally, and fandom is not necessarily better at it than the general population. So things that are systemic, folks in anti-black cultures will tend not to promote black characters, get converted to individual moral failings. You are a racist for not shipping this thing, in a way that is both inaccurate and foreclosing of dialogue, even though we can be critical of hurt majoritarian feelings playing a role in that. Billy, I agree with some of your overarching points, Mel, but would like clarification on others if I may be so bold. I would like to offer a series of provocations, not because of vehement disagreement, but to address some key factors that I think may need expansion and development. Now, I agree for the most part about the idea of power, privilege and domination. But I don't believe it's so neat and pat. In actual fact, I believe there is a tendency in academic spheres to construct what I would term a hierarchy of privilege. In most accounts, it is racial, gender and sexuality privileges that stand at the apex of this hierarchy. As illustrated above. As Mel wrote, whiteness is a relation of domination, hegemonic masculinity is a relation of domination, heterosexism is a relation of domination. I am not about to counter that in any way, as I think Mel, Ruckmany and Richard are right. But there is more to privilege than race, gender and sexuality. One thing that seems to have been almost completely erased from consideration is class privilege, mental health privilege, neurotypical privilege, able-bodied privilege, employment privilege, and so on. This is something that is very much a key part of my everyday life, and I would like to draw attention to some issues that I feel demand redress. Before I continue, I would like to ensure that I am not disagreeing with the notion of white, masculine, heterosexual privilege. Far from it. But in the spirit of debate, I'd like to raise fundamental issues as I see them. So, I was born on a council estate in Sunderland, a town, awarded city status in 1992, with a lengthy industrial vintage, including shipbuilding and coal mining. During the miners' strike in the 80s, Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party adopted a strategy that set out to break and fragment working-class solidarity, a strategy that largely succeeded in many ways. Nowadays, Sunderland is a pale shadow of its former self. Industry has been decimated and erased completely in most cases, and largely replaced by the ubiquitous call center. The shipyards and coal mines are long gone, and Vox Breweries, a major employer in the area for 2 decades, is now a distant memory. The land vacated some time ago to make way for car parking facilities. This is the political and geographical context within which I grew up, and an enormous reason why I have identified as a Marxist for much of my adult life. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 380. I spent the majority of my life in abject poverty. Many of us were told in school that we had little in the way of career prospects and would end up working in a shop or garage. Class, working class and underclass, was thus a key component in the formation of my identity. I have also struggled with undiagnosed autism for much of my life, having just been diagnosed 6 months ago, and also struggle with PTSD. However, because I attended university in 2007 and received a BA degree, and then went on to study for a PhD, I am now suddenly and magically framed as privileged because I am white and male. I use myself as an example anecdotally because I see this as a kind of praxis based in the reality of everyday life as I experience it. So, I agree, I possess white, masculine heterosexual privilege, so I tick all the boxes in the hierarchy. Hence, I am privileged, unequivocally and unquestionably. It is simply too easy, and too reductive to view privilege according to the dominant narrative. I am not neurotypically privileged, I am not able-bodied privileged, I am not privileged in terms of class, until 2014 when I was awarded a PhD and successfully obtained a full-time position at Bournemouth University. Somehow the latter expunges my entire life, history, identity, ontology and self-narrative, so that the hierarchy of privilege can remain intact. But I strongly think that this does a disservice to a broad range of the global populace, especially given how the rhetoric of privilege is used to discipline and police white, heterosexual males. To reiterate, I am not claiming that these characteristics are not privileged ones. But this has not been the only way in which I have experienced the world. This brings me to the idea of domination as a key site for toxic fan practices, and I shall keep that in scare quotes until I'm convinced it is necessary. My earlier comment about the central focus being on white heterosexual males, which Bertha quite rightly said is uncomfortable and I think it should be, just as I think provocation is a necessary strategy to avoid academia becoming dogmatic, is not about claiming that this area of study isn't worth pursuing. But I admit to feeling aggrieved that because I am white, heterosexual and male, that dictates how I am seen by others as occupying a position of domination, and I'm not saying that I don't in some instances. In one of the articles in the themes section, Margarero Pico, Maria Jose Estables, and Rafael Ventura examine toxicity centered on the dead lesbian syndrome trope in relation to the fictional death of Lexia, a queer character in the US TV series The 100. I'm sure many scholars are aware of the backlash that emerged as a result, with fans tweeting directly to producers on the show to complain and criticize, often in ways that could be described as toxic. Based on our conversation thus far, it is quite fascinating that what the authors also examine is the way that queers fans within the LChat forum also engaged in policing practices to discipline fan toxicity from within, intra-fandom, so as not to contaminate their highly visible and public protests. Naturally, that did not prevent some fans from doing so. As we have already agreed that heterosexuality and masculinity are forms of privilege, how might we address toxicity of this nature? For queer toxicity is not a form of. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 381. Privilege, or a kind of domination in the ideological sense. So, I don't necessarily agree that toxicity always comes from sites of domination and privilege. In actual fact, I have been taken by existing research in intersectional feminism, which also rebukes the umbrella concept of patriarchy as too neat and tidy, incapable of capturing the social, cultural and ideological dynamics of the world. Incidentally, feminist repeal of patriarchy as umbrella goes back to the early 80s, as Shira Tarrant puts it in Men and Feminism. Yet it is not the case that men always have privilege even if they are at the center. In certain instances, it is possible for men to simultaneously inhabit many worlds with different degrees of privilege and powerlessness. Some men experience masculine privilege within a family setting or on the job, yet they may also experience disadvantage as, say, a black man in white-dominated settings or as a Muslim man in white, Christian communities. 109. From this perspective, power and privilege are neither dominant nor dormant, but intersectional, with multifaceted lines of conflict existing within a system of ruling and oppression. I think that this is a more productive framework than the current hierarchy of privilege can cope with, and which leaves a lot of people behind. I certainly don't agree that researchers should be anything but neutral. There are ways to examine and analyze without casting moral judgments on fanish behavior, and I think Richard's examples of Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men and Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem are excellent instantiations of non-moral and non-judgmental studies of genocide and mass murder. I have cited Matt Hill's thinking in Fan Cultures before, but it really struck a chord with me, never being far from my mind when embarking on research endeavors. One of the main points Hills makes is that he adopts a suspensionist position, that is to say, a position which refuses to split fandom into the good and the bad, and which embraces inescapable contradiction, the ugly. This means approaching the contradictions of fan cultures and cult media as essential cultural negotiations that can only be closed-won at the cost of ignoring fandom's cultural dynamics. 2002-13. I am especially concerned about this closing down, and this can be linked back to my comments about the hierarchy of privilege. Note, at this point, I have never been as convinced as I am now that the concept of toxicity is not needed as an academic term if we already have other terms that do the job. Hostility, aggression, bullying, racism, classism, weightism, homophobia, transphobia, neurotypicalism, and so on and so forth. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 382. Richard. I think what Billy is saying here is not just compelling, but vitally important, and I just want to quickly follow up on his comments before everyone else responds. I am especially intrigued by this idea of a hierarchy of privilege, although I am not entirely certain these hierarchies are consistent across all contexts, with race and gender always at the apex. After all, fan communities often function as subcultural spaces, where power and privilege can take unconventional or even highly unlikely forms. This in turn would change the kinds of fan behavior deemed toxic in those spaces, as well as determining the impact those practices have on the people who populate or pass through them. So yes, hostile fan interactions, including bullying, exclusion, harassment, policing, and all those other terms we have already discussed, are always likely to be bound up with relations of power, but Billy's points about hierarchy and intersectionality should remind us that we may be overestimating our ability to predict what these relations are, or which ones are the most important in a given situation. This brings me back to something I discussed earlier about methodology. If our research begins from the premise that hostility must be tied to particular forms of privilege, then I fear we are destined to only ever see small parts of a much more complex picture. There is no question that whiteness and masculinity are key frameworks that we should be considering, but they certainly shouldn't be the only two, especially if we are to have any hope of answering some of the fascinating questions Henry posed. Instead, I think we need to develop ways of researching hostility that allow for the possibility of unexpected explanations to enter our field of vision. I don't think what I am advocating for here constitutes both sidesism. Indeed, my point is precisely that conflicts never have just two sides to them, and thinking in terms of sides may result in wedding ourselves to particular lines of inquiry, when in fact there may be many more that we are ignoring. If we are going to study instances of cultural ugliness and hostility, and I definitely think we need to be, then I want us to be mapping their contours in as much detail as possible, rather than making inferences on the basis of their most visible landmarks. Now, apologies for not expressing myself more clearly. I wasn't saying anyone was engaging in both sidesism here, but rather the fantasy that objectivity is possible or even desirable requires treating things as neutral, when nothing is neutral, and then both sidesism is the end point of that. But I absolutely agree with you, Richard, that the particular forms any given instance of toxicity takes can be read off from the identities of the participants, because there is obviously much more to the dynamics. My point was more that the capacity and felt entitlement to marginalize others is unevenly distributed from the start, which explains some patterns even before we get down to fandom-specific or interpersonal dynamics. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 383. Raise that up front because I have seen so many people, in general, not necessarily in this conversation, go straight to the fandom-specific or interpersonal dynamics without considering those conditioning structures. We need both. Ruckmany. To build on what Mel has said above, I also want to clarify that when I talk about considering the operations of power and privilege in approaching toxicity in fan practices, I am not advocating for some sort of moral positioning by researchers. To me, it is just good research practice to be aware of these dynamics while also paying attention to how internal exchanges can complicate our understandings of the same. As the problem of positionality also came up, I want to push back on the idea that identifying structural dynamics like racism/sexism/homophobia is by definition taking a moral stand. I don't think my work is, or can be, neutral simply because I don't think any work can occupy that position. As someone trained in post-colonial studies, I am always acutely aware of the way in which so-called neutral methodological and theoretical tools are very often built on assumptions that must be questioned and dismantled. I always talk about the whiteness of our bibliographies and fan studies, so when we discuss how we are approaching these problems, maybe we should also be thinking about who we see as essential reading when approaching those issues. Rebecca Wanzo's 2015 excellent piece about the genealogies of fan studies is pretty relevant here, as she notes that one of the reasons race may be neglected is because it troubles some of the claims and desires at the heart of fan studies scholars and their scholarship. So, for me, discussing how these structure fan spaces is precisely in order to not come to any pat conclusions about intra-fandom power dynamics or to deploy broad-based assumptions about any particular group of fans. My own work is absolutely built on the need to deploy nuance and intersectionality to analyze messy interactions between fans. In fact, one of the biggest challenges in my research has been to find a way to express the very complex, context-specific ideas of race, racism in a transnational, transcultural context and track how privilege and power work in unexpected ways in these spaces. I think a good example of this messiness is the controversy in the 100 fandom and the death of one of the central queer characters, Lakesa, who was part of the fan favorite, bearing Kligza. There was a lot of justifiable anger amongst fans about the shocking twist. However, building on that reaction, fans of color in turn critiqued Kligza fans of having ignored, or actively celebrated, the racist aspects of the show up until that point. Were there fans of color for whom Kligza as queer representation was important? Yes. Were there white and queer fans who were historically critical of the racist aspects of the show? Absolutely. As a researcher approaching this situation, I would say that talking about structural whiteness in an analysis of the controversy as a whole is not to invalidate these reactions or lump individual fans into homogeneous groups. You're racist, I would argue. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 384. That, in fact, it brings the complex workings of identification and representation and pleasure within fan spaces to the forefront. Bertha. I think Billy brings up a fascinating point about hierarchy of privilege here, and it calls to Catherine Larson and Lynn Zupernis's argument and fan culture, theory, practice on how our own biases, disciplinary background and otherwise, as well as our experience with fandom will limit our understandings of the field in general. And yes, Rukmini is also absolutely right about the structural whiteness that impinges our approach to the field. In a way, this reminds me of when Lori Morimoto and I first started our work on transcultural fandom. The resistance we felt came from both sides. On the one hand, we were discussing something which, given our structural whiteness, were foreign and may not necessarily apply, at the time, to most people's experience of fandom. On the other hand, in our desire to move the conceptualization of non-Western fandom away from being merely embedded in the discourse of the otaku, the other resistance was that we were depoliticizing Asian cultural studies and putting too much emphasis on practices that were, in essence, considered structurally Western, namely, also white. And here I am going to go back to what I said earlier, about bringing in the uncomfortableness, which I think takes into account what Billy was saying about hierarchy of privilege. That in order to move past our anxieties about homogenization and assigning privilege when we accrue certain cultural, economic, and perhaps especially, educational capitals, we need to also look at the gaps and silences. In my case, it is to acknowledge the various internalisms, that is the internal sexism, misogyny, racism, colonialism, no matter how uncomfortable it may be to acknowledge its existence. So, for instance, Felicity Smoke's recent unpopularity in the Arrow fandom is because she's diverting attention away from the male superhero, and in the process, her pairing with Oliver Queen has made the main character weak, and her fans, and those who support the Olicity pairing, are subjected to hostility and vitriol because of this fan reading, performed not by male fans. I can't help but think that there is some level of unconscious, internal misogyny at work here. So, yes, while it isn't as controversial as the issue surrounding Kligza and the 100 fandom, for fans of Felicity Smoke, who view her character as a positive incarnation of women in STEM, as a superhero without a mask, this toxicity can be devastating. Am I not being objective when I'm performing this reading, that what seems to be happening may not be internalized misogyny as such, but just fans disliking one character in favor of another? But fandom policing has resulted in conflict and hostility, which often results in one voice being subjugated over another, so it is also a complex set of issues and emotions, or is it affect? In essence, I want to recall what Richard said, that in approaching our research, we should be aware of the various intersections that impinge our approach, as well as the conflicts that we see in fandom. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 385. Bridget. Talking about toxic masculinity is quite en vogue, and I think corresponds with some recent and deeply troubling political and social events: the rise of the alt-right, Trump's election, greater visibility to white nationalism, mass shootings. One of the points on which Billy and I disagree, though, is that there has been some kind of shift or turn toward greater toxicity within fan cultures in recent years. As someone whose work is often historical, I am naturally skeptical of any claims of newness or of firstness, because these claims often indicate we haven't dug deeply enough in history. Fan studies is a notoriously contemporary-focused discipline, and I think there is a lot of room for more work on historical constructions of fans and fan communities. Doing so will, I firmly believe, demonstrate that some of the contemporary phenomena we see discussed so often in academic work and in the pop press has actually always existed, but that perhaps our contemporary technologies just render it more visible. I'd like to see the concepts of toxic fan practices and the dark side of fandom extended to more historical projects. Billy. Just jump in and say that I don't think we disagree at all. I have been quite clear that what I mean is that it is a discourse centered on toxicity that emerges around 2014, not that it is a new phenomenon. In fact, I have, and many others, have argued specifically that there is a longer vintage in historical terms. The so-called alt-right, for example, did not emerge ex nihilo in 2014 either, but discourses about the alt-right, or at least the radical right, certainly began to stir and accelerated in 2016. I am talking about regimes of truth, not truth itself. To bring the conversation back to Rukmini's last comment about the 100, I mentioned earlier that some toxic fan practices emerging from forums such as the L-chat were neither dominant nor masculine, but a form of what might be described as queer toxicity. But I'd like to bring back the discussion to other avenues of query if I may. One point that I fear has been lost is about methodology, epistemology and neutrality. I should have pointed out that while researchers can only hope to be as objective as possible, with the proviso that true objectivity 'tis but a myth, it is possible to be neutral by not casting more aspersions and judgments, which returns us to an earlier question I proposed. Should we, as researchers, be making claims about fan toxicity ourselves, or addressing discursive instantiations whereby the term is marshaled by fans, journalists and bloggers, etc.? I think this is a crucial question, because as soon as we point and claim toxicity, then we have made a moral judgment. I'm not saying that we can't, I just wonder what others think about this. Once more, this is because I am not quite certain that the term is required in academic research unless it is examining what is discursively viewed as toxic, rather than scholars making those judgments. I think neutrality is achievable by the language we adopt and how we discuss these issues, rather than being objective in any pure sense. There are many instances of scholars making assumptions and constructing. Volume 15, Issue 1. May 2018. Page 386. Figures of the audience, as Martin Barker describes it, which are imputations rather than supported by data and other empirical evidence, as Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner have argued, and which I agree wholly, even as I've quoted this numerous times in various ways. Not knowing who created what a say creators meant to accomplish, or what a given text really means, forces one to stay empirical and focus on the things that can be known and confirmed. My emphasis. Bertha. I would, very quickly, want to ask if language is ever neutral though? Our disciplinary background may already frame us in a certain manner that would influence our approach to notions of toxicity or fandom, or, for that matter, Rukmini and IR, for instance, writing in a language that was brought to our home countries due to our colonial past. I can't speak on behalf of Rukmini here, but as a Bornean, with the Malaysian state where I am from existing in the past as a private English kingdom under the rule of one family for more than a century, and with family ties that is still today linked to said family, I don't think my language can ever be neutral, no matter how I choose to reflexive about it. But I also want to address Bridget's point here, that I agree concepts of toxic fan practices and the dark side of fandom should be extended to historical projects as well. I think technology, in particular, social media, has afforded a more public view of fandom. And coupled it with shifting industry practices where media producers are taking to social media platforms to not only show. That is all for right now. If you liked this video, or you new on this channel, then hit that like and subscribe button if you want me to make more like this. Until then, peace out.